How's it going, American History 2 students? This is Mr. Bell coming back at you with another online video lesson. Today we are actually going to start Unit 5 Part 2 that focuses on the Cold War. Unit 5 Part 1 was World War II. I'll get into that in a moment. But before we get started, this is day 155 of 180 of the regular school year. It's COVID-19 shutdown day 28. This is your lesson for Monday, May 4th. 2020. For you Star Wars fans, may the 4th be with you, like myself. Define appeasement. This is giving in to a dictator in return for a promise of being left alone. This is what Chamberlain did to Hitler in World War II. It does not work. If you give the bully your lunch money not once, not twice, but 3 times, and you continue to give him your lunch money, he's going to know he can take it. The Marshall Plan. This was George Marshall, the Secretary of State for Truman's plan to rebuild Europe post-World War II and divide Germany into 3 sections, British, Russian, and American. Rebuild those sections and turn it back over to the Germans. Russia did not do that. Instead, they built the Berlin Wall. Which president is the only to use nuclear weapons? It is Harry S. Truman at Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II. So, let's review. Appeasement, giving in to a dictator's demands in exchange for the promise of being left alone. It does not work. The Marshall Plan, the plan to rebuild Europe post-World War II, mainly economic aid, money. Which president's the only to use nuclear weapons? Truman. So, let's go ahead and move on here to Unit 5, Part 2. Now, I do this a little different. So what I do is post-World War II in Unit 5 Part 2, I cover everything from 1945 to 1989, 1990, just Cold War. And then going to Unit 6, I go back in time and cover everything from that point to today, minus the Cold War stuff. I think this Cold War stuff is a good match with the World War II stuff because the Cold War is a direct result of World War II. So we talked a lot about in this class this kind of battle between who will be the dominant world empire, with the Navy being the key aspect to a nation's military that can set them apart as far as military superiority. Now, when it comes to this portion of not just American but world history, Germany has fallen by the wayside. Hitler's gone. So now the question becomes, who will be the next dominant world power? What will be the new dominant ideology as far as the government's concerned? Will it be democracy in the United States wants, freedom and democracy, or will it be communism and totalitarianism like what Russia, the Soviet Union wants? And this battle, known as the Cold War, has several what's called proxy wars. In other words, Russia and America not fighting directly, but putting proxies in place. Basically, take something like Vietnam or the Korean War, interfering in those conflicts to harm one another, especially the Russians trying to harm the Americans. This is the closest we've ever come to a all-out nuclear war in the United States, or in the world for that matter. But it's called a Cold War because war never breaks out officially between Russia and the United States. Otherwise, this would be called World War III, not the Cold War. So, while there may not be a direct conflict as far as fighting, it is one of the most interesting conflicts in the history of the world. So, we're going to start today with 5.6, which is foreign policy of the Cold War. Now, this is the unit that I also talk about JFK. He comes up in 5.7. More on him in the next video. The Cold War spans every president from Truman through Bush 41. So every president from 45 to 1990, basically. So a lot of presidents have to deal with this Cold War, all trying to avoid nuclear war with the Russians. So without further ado, let's get started. We talked about the Cold War, democracy versus communism. Churchill coined the phrase the Iron Curtain. It was the ideology of communism falling over Europe. It was a promise by Russia, the Soviet Union, to take care of these nations post-World War II And while communism, where there's no private property, the government controls everything, and in a true communism, in a pure communist country like we have here, probably the purest example of communism, this in early communist China in world history, there is no belief in God. There is no freedom of religion, because that would mean that something comes before the state or the country in that case. So when I say Russia is Russia, I know that sounds dumb, but it'll make sense here in a second. When I say Soviet Union, it also implies several nations in Europe that Russia took over as part of becoming the USSR, the United States of the Socialist Republic. The Iron Curtain is a metaphorical phrase. It's not a literal Iron Curtain of communism sweeping over Europe. So there's multiple policies that the United States has toward communism, and they vary from president to president. Some are similar, some are vastly different. The first policy that we have is containment. Let's cap communism. Let's try to stop it from spreading. That is the goal here. Not to defeat it, but to contain it. And this is going to be kind of the Cold War policy of Truman and Eisenhower. And as part of this, you have the Truman Doctrine and the Eisenhower Doctrine. Now, this doesn't mean a doctrine like this is going to help you get through COVID-19. If you remember, a doctrine is a president's beliefs in dealing with other countries, aka foreign policy. So, the Truman Doctrine is giving military and economic aid, so giving protection from our military and money to Greece and Turkey. Why do we do that? We want to make sure that communism isn't appealing to them, which is kind of ironic considering we're giving them money. We want them to create free and democratic societies, which happens in which, whether that ends up happening or not, I'll leave that to your world history teachers. In Turkey, definitely not in present day, and Greece is a pretty socialist country. So in long term it didn't work, in the short term it did. Greece and Turkey did not fall to communism, and they didn't want, when I say they, the United States and the Truman administration, to lose more countries to communism, because they've already lost places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and multiple other European nations that we can talk about here in a bit. We mentioned the Marshall Plan. We're giving economic aid to Western Europe and hope that they will embrace democracy and not communism. We covered this really in 5.5, so I'm not going to hit it hard here. The Eisenhower Doctrine. So Eisenhower is going to come in and be president from 52 to 60. He becomes famous for the Doomsday. Good God, for the D-Day invasion. Doomsday does sound cool, but that's a Superman villain. That is not the name of a battle in World War II or the Cold War. The Eisenhower Doctrine is giving economic aid and military protection to the Middle East. We don't want the Middle East to fall to communism. And here is why. Oil, oil, oil. It's the most valuable resource probably in the world besides land, and land is more valuable if it has oil, because as you know, because of gasoline, the world runs on oil, and we cannot allow communist Russia to take control of the world's oil supply in the Middle East. So we'll see what happens in the Middle East in relation to Russia later. Here's some Cold War facts. So this is just an overview. Stalin is not going to be premier communist dictator long. He actually dies at the start of the Cold War from a stroke, and Nikita Khrushchev takes over. The Berlin Wall goes up. I'm going to skip ahead here. Where's my Berlin Wall? Somewhere on here. Hold on. So the Berlin Wall goes up actually when Kennedy's president, and we'll talk about that in depth in 5.7. But you see on this map here you have the zone. This was all Germany right here, this British, US, French, and the Soviet zone. Each group, and I forgot to mention the French earlier, you see they have a very small zone here, was tasked with rebuilding their section, then leaving. The problem is they don't leave. Instead, they take this over, the Russians do, and they put up this barrier known as the Berlin Wall. The Iron Curtain is not the Berlin Wall. The Iron Curtain is not a literal, it's a figurative thing. It's a phrase of speech used to describe the sweeping of communism over Europe by Winston Churchill. So the Berlin Wall divides basically communist part of Europe, which is Eastern, to the free part of Europe, which is Western. And we'll come back to the Berlin Wall in 5.7. Sorry, I skipped ahead there. So that should be in bold. Beautiful thing is I can do that on the fly here a lot easier than I can in class. Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. This is an agreement by the U.S. and Russia not to test atomic devices. You can forget about that. There was plenty of testing of atomic devices, mainly in New Mexico for the United States. The hydrogen bomb is a superatomic bomb. It can destroy entire cities. It is like 10 times more powerful than what was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So here's some key events that we're going to go over in depth as we move through the Cold War. Berlin airlift, Korean War, Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, the Chinese Civil War. We're going to, cover most of these in depth, and it's interesting to see how many conflicts, like major conflicts like the Korean War, are actually a smaller part of this overall conflict known as the Cold War. So let's hit the Korean War. You could take a whole class on the Korean War. You can read multiple books on the Korean War. I'm giving you a trying to be precise overview of the Korean War. So, what happens when we talk about the Korean War? Okay, so at the time of the Korean War, when it starts, I have to excuse me here, get a drink of water, excuse me. Truman is president. Northern Korea and South Korea have gotten into a civil war. South Korea wants to be free. North Korea wants to embrace communism. Russia and China back North Korea, and the USA intervenes on South Korea's behalf. Sorry if you hear my daughter screaming in the background. She wants in here. So when we go into Korea, which is a UN operation led by the U.S., meaning that, yes, we were calling the shots as far as what we were doing over there, but the UN had sent forces from several other free nations to help us. But the goal over there when we went was to make sure that South Korea didn't become communist. It wasn't to defeat North Korea. It wasn't to stop communism from spreading, from communism in North Korea. It was to stop it from spreading to South Korea. So it goes back to that policy of containment that Truman and Eisenhower believed heavily in. Things really kind of go awry here. Douglas MacArthur is the overall commander. If you remember him, he was the overall commander for the Allied forces in the Pacific. He's the overall commander for the U.S. forces when this conflict starts in Korea. But there's a problem. China is sending insurgents into Korea. In other words, Chinese soldiers are coming into North Korea and they're killing American troops. MacArthur wants to attack China and start a war with China. Now, Truman's not interested in World War III, just a couple, seemingly, it feels like months, but years after World War II has ended. So instead, he fires MacArthur. He makes sure that we have a clearly defined goal of containment over there. We're not trying to defeat communism. We're just trying to stop it from spreading to South Korea. Now, there was intense pressure for Truman to get involved in this war from Republicans. Truman's a Democrat. Many viewed him as weak in the media. Many voters viewed him as weak, which is crazy considering he is the guy that dropped 2 atomic bombs. I don't know how you could call that weak, but that's beside the point there. But he had intense public pressure. So he does send, even though he's not going to run for re-election again, he has intense public pressure. And it's a lot of pressure on the Democratic Party. So he sends a UN operation over there, and it's a success. The 38th parallel is created, and it divides North and South Korea. The 38th parallel, with everything in North being communist, with everything in South being free. The capital of North Korea is Pyongyang. The capital of South Korea is Seoul. So you see, Seoul can be problematic because it is right at the border of North and South Korea, where Pyongyang's a little further north. Here's one of my favorite images to show students. So here you have satellite images of North and South Korea. You see China there too. This is from CBS News, of North and South Korea at night. You see all the heat activity here. This is people out and about, going to the movies, going to restaurants. If you went to Seoul, it looks like a more futuristic version of New York City. Seoul is where they go in Black Panther, if you've seen that movie, to find Ulysses Claw, and when they fight him, and there's that big chase on the street. So, I mean, that was not done for a Marvel movie as far as making that city look futuristic. You can Google Seoul, that's how it works. Whereas North Korea here, where they keep everybody in their homes for the most part except to work for the state. The government owns all land, true communist country. The government provides protection, so you don't really have any rights as far as gun ownerships and things of that nature. There's nothing going on. It's desolate. It's weird because the southern part of North Korea is more like jungle terrain, but as you get up here, it's very mountainous, and there's a steep differentiation as far as the geography from up here to down here. But either way, it's not a pleasant place to be, whether you're in the mountainous, awful region up here or the more jungle terrain. What you would probably think of seeing like Vietnam in movies would be like here near Pyongyang. So one thing I like to tell students is probably the most famous company from South Korea is LG. And, you know, LG makes phones, they make TVs. But there is a story that always really stuck with me about LG in North and South Korea. I don't tell these stories as much on here as I would in class, but here I think it would be poignant to make my point clear. So there was a story of a man who somehow smuggled in, I don't know how he got it in, don't ask me that, sorry, an LG TV. He had got one from South Korea, and he was caught with that in his home. And all the TVs in North Korea have a chip where you can only get 3 channels, and it's all propaganda. Now, the Un family, the Jong family, Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il, and there was the first Kim Jong, have run North Korea, and they passed it down, you know, from generation to generation. And they're tyrants, is what they are. They're tyrant dictators. There was a gentleman who was caught with the LG TV from South Korea, and he was sentenced to work in a work camp until his death. They worked him to death, then they executed him just for having an LG TV. So that really makes you value the freedoms you have in the United States. And of course, if you were in South Korea, the freedoms you have there. These are pictures of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, one of the most intense places in the history, not in the history of the world, in the world right now, from the Korean War up until this very day. The DMZ, you have soldiers on the northern side from North Korea, the southern side from South Korea. On the southern side, you also have U.S. troops. And if you step over that line, it's considered an act of war. Now, this is the northern part. Here you see the southern part. This is tourists coming in and taking pictures of this historic site. They say that this war never ended the Korean War. Rather, it is a ceasefire, and they have just stopped fighting, and they could start fighting any day. There is a ton of military bases in Seoul for the United States. So the fear is always that Pyongyang would attack Seoul, North would attack South Korea. It would hit a lot of U.S. military personnel, and we would be at a second Korean War. So that would be problematic. Thank God, knock on wood, that hasn't happened to this day. So this is the main part of the DMZ. Here's the outer part of the DMZ. You see there, you're not getting over that. And even if you could, there's landmines all throughout here. You put pressure on it, you remove it, boom, you're a dead man or a dead woman. Many have tried, they've all failed. It is nearly impossible to get from North to South Korea, and you would never want to go south to north. You're going to stay put. So there's plenty of videos and stuff you can look up about the DMZ. let's end 5.7 here with the military-industrial complex. This is a speech that Eisenhower gave when he left office. Presidents give farewell addresses usually the week before they finish their last term. In this case, it was the end of his second term. And Eisenhower was a really good president, even progressive, one might say, for a Republican. We'll talk about that when we get to civil rights. And his most famous speech was the military-industrial complex. In other words, he warned that America's economy and the American people are becoming too reliant on wars, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, to fuel this economy, to fuel manufacturing, to fuel production, to fuel, the employment rate, and to keep the unemployment rate low. And he said America needs to wean itself off of a wartime economy. We have to become a sustainable economy without fighting major wars. So that is the military-industrial complex, is the fear that the U.S. economy relies too much on war to function. So that's it for 5.6. For 5.7, we'll get into one of my favorite topics, JFK and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I hope this video has helped you understand the basics of the Cold War. I do want to cover one more thing here that actually two more things before we wrap up, because I did kind of skip around. So let me do that before I wrap up. The Berlin airlift was one of the first conflicts of the Cold War. This is right before Stalin has a stroke and passes away. People on the German side of Berlin, on the Berlin Wall, the eastern side of what would be the Berlin Wall. The wall's not up yet. The wall doesn't go up until, I think, 61. Or it's not completed as you and I know it until 61. So there is an attempt by the Allied forces, the French, the United States, the British, what were the Allies minus Russia in World War II, to help people who were suffering on the eastern side of Germany because of communism. And they said they were going to give all these people this land, this food, and it just wasn't possible at that time. So what happened was the Allied forces dropped supplies, food, blanket, water, just bare necessities. And there was a choice that Stalin had here. He could strike those aircrafts down and begin World War III right after World War II, because this is in 1945, I believe. Or he could let them just deliver the supplies and bite the bullet on this one. So what did they do? He closed all Allied ground transportation. So what they do, as I mentioned, they went by air. They flew supplies. They dropped supplies into Berlin. And Stalin, this is one of the rare times he pulls back in order to avoid a conflict. He knew that they needed those supplies, and he knew they weren't getting out. The Chinese Civil War. The U.S. is not involved in this because we're so focused on Russia. Now, China later goes on, as we mentioned, to aid North Korea in the Korean War. There's the same type of divide in China that there is in Korea between communism and freedom. In this case, communism and a democratic government, freedom. Chiang Kai-shek is the leader of China. There is an intense push for communism, saying that China has been too reliant on Western nations, going back to the Boxer Rebellion and John Hay's open door policy, and that there should be a desire for them to do better. So just like communism swept over North Korea, many parts of Europe, is happening in Southeast Asia as well. China falls to communism, Chiang Kai-shek flees to Taiwan, and Mao becomes the communist leader of China. Taiwan becomes an almost half China. So here's what I mean by that. Taiwanese people consider themselves to be independent of China and an independent country. Chinese people consider Chinese people consider Taiwan to be part of China, and they still have a lot of military control. So that's going to be it for today's lesson. Sorry I had to go back and cover those. I just want y'all to get all the information, because this isn't, I think, entertaining, but an important thing to cover. If you have any questions about this, please email me at bsbell@clevelandcountyschools.org. Thank you so much. Stay safe.